Hello everyone and welcome to the new firmware for Ruckus. I'm going to just dive right in so that we can get through the configuration on how to program the Ruckus APs with the new 200.18 firmware. There are quite a few changes, and anything that I do not cover, we're just going to assume that it's going to stay defaulted and we're going to make no changes to those settings. If you guys have any questions or anything like that, you can always feel free to call in and we'll be happy to answer those questions. But we're just going to get right into the setup guide. So first of all, when you're logging in for the first time, you're just going to use the IP address. I'm going to go ahead and just go straight back to the default that it had from DHCP, and we have the quick install page. We're going to set the SSID name. So in this case, I'm just going to name it test. And then for the admin, I'm just going to leave admin. The passphrase, I'm going to set there are new requirements that you're going to have a character that is capitalized, a number, and a special character. So in this case, I'm just going to use password 1 exclamation. And we're just going to make it super simple just for this test. But you're going to need, again, the capital, the 1, and the exclamation. Same thing for here. I'm just going to set the same password. And we're going to hit apply. This will do the quick setup where it's going to generate the configuration for you. It will then start loading in all the settings, and we'll get to the setup page once it's done. All right, now that everything is done and it's created, we're going to go ahead and just go straight back to the IP address again. Okay, now you're going to notice the new login page. It's very different from the other version, but it's still the same. We're just going to log in with our credentials. Okay, here's the new Ruckus UI. And now they have the Unleash portal is a free remote management service notification here. What they're talking about is you can manage some of the Ruckus APs per location on the new Ruckus portal that they have for Unleashed. I believe there is a limit to how many sites you can have available to that, and that will be covered on our updated guide as an additional option if you choose to do that. Now, with the new setup, there is the Ruckus app as well. We still don't recommend using the Ruckus app, but it can be used in cases where you would like to set things up. However, again, we don't recommend it because there have been conflicts in the past between the Ruckus app not applying the settings correctly or coming into conflict when you use the web interface to do some of your configuration. So we'll go ahead and just close this out for now. Now we can see that we have our network profile here for like the AP. This is going to be the AP that we're logged into. It's gateway, it's DNS. It'll give us the name, the uptime, how many access points, how many switches. Now down here, you're going to see that there's some information that it's going to also give us. Of course, since this is a test, we're not going to see some information just yet, and we haven't set anything up. But you'll be able to see the client status, traffic trends, top applications used by the clients, and then the clients that are using the most data. So it's really kind of insightful as far as some of the information that's going to be given. As far as the setup goes, we're going to go to system settings first, and we're going to go through each one of these sections. We'll start with the system info. Under system management, this is where we're going to give the name for your Unleashed system. This is going to be the firmware version. And next, we're going to go to our location. This is going to be important now because there are new standards. You're going to see this AFC here. Now with the 6 gigahertz bandwidth, there are some new settings, especially with this AFC. AFC standing for Automated Frequency Coordination. To sum it up, it's to manage the use of the frequencies in the 6 gigahertz band to prevent interference with licensed users. For location, you're going to enter the address of where you're installing these access points. In this case, we're just going to use our office address. And then you're going to enter the latitude and longitude. These entries have to be filled in order for you to use AFC's standards, because if not, the power will be reduced when using external Wi-Fi. And that's because, again, they have to coordinate the channels that are being used within the airspace. So the latitude and longitude is going to be very important. You can get that from Google Maps, Google Earth, things like that. And that's what I used to get this information for our office. So for the T670 and other outdoor APs, this is a must requirement to enter. For AFC height, what you're going to want to do is you want to set the minimum floors and the maximum floors. In this case, the minimum floors is going to be 0. 0 is going to be your first floor. So 1 would not be your first floor. It'd actually be 0 in this case since they're starting at that scale. And then any additional floors, well, then you would add another number to that. So in this case, if you had 2 floors, then it's just going to be 1. If you had 3 floors, then it's going to be 2. But if you're just working with a 1 floor building, then you're just going to enter 0 for both fields. And then make sure to hit apply. Next, we're going to do the dedicated master. The dedicated master is when you're going to have one AP that's specifically specified for the function of running the Unleashed dashboard and everything else. Now, this is not always needed, but these are the recommended AP models that can handle that. Now, this is going to be for installs that are going to be with a lot of access points. We're talking about 20 or more. Otherwise, you don't have to use the dedicated master. What you can use is the preferred master. The preferred master is just you stating which AP you want to be the primary one. In this case, we're using the outdoor T670. And if you have additional ones, you can set them as your secondary. So unlike the dedicated master, the preferred master will be broadcasting and being used like a normal access point so that clients will connect to it. Next, we're going to go to the switch approval. This is just going to stay standard, have it checked. It will automatically want to add any of the Ruckus switches that are compatible with it. System time is going to be the same. You're going to want to set it for your time zone, make sure it's all updated so that any logging that occurs will help us with troubleshooting if anything turns to pop up. Next, we'll be moving to the wireless section here of the settings. We're going to start with mesh. Mesh will be disabled by default, however, you can enable it. Once you enable it, you cannot disable it without defaulting the rest of the APs. So make sure that you want to enable this before you do. Will it cause an issue if you don't use meshing? No. All it is that if an access point is powered but not connected via the Ethernet, then it will be able to mesh with another AP. So one thing to keep in mind with mesh is that one radio is dedicated for the mesh connection. So if you have a 2x2 radio, one of those radios is going to be used for the mesh connection between one access point and another. If you have a 4x4 radio, then one of those radios again will be used for the mesh connection. What that means is that the clients will connect on the other available radio. In the terms of the 2x2, it's just going to be that one other radio. In a 4x4 AP, then it's going to be on the other 3 that are available. So that will reduce the potential throughput as far as what your Wi-Fi connection is going to be in terms of speed. So just keep that in mind when setting up mesh. Next, we'll go over the country code. For the country code, it's going to be selected as the United States as default, and it's going to be optimized for performance. Now, this is going to be the difference. It used to be compatibility, now it's optimized for performance. However, keep in mind that with optimized performance, it's going to use DFS channels. And when using DFS channels, if you have any type of like weather radar, airports or like planes flying overhead, it's going to take priority on those channel spaces. So if they happen to overlap, then devices will drop automatically instead of transferring to another channel because they get priority in that airspace. Next is going to be the automatic wireless optimization. Here you're going to recognize that we're going to be able to change what settings we want for the background scanning. In this case, we want to make sure that channel fly is selected for both 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz. And as far as the optimized period on when you want to do that, you can select periods of low utilization on the network, or you can set it to whatever standard you'd like. In this case, I'm just going to set it for 12 and 8 just as an example. I'll set the same thing here for the 6 gigahertz channel. Now, as far as the automatically adjust AP power, radio power, this setting I only apply at the very end of troubleshooting when the APs are too close to each other. So when you have oversaturation and our later settings are not enough to reduce that overlap so that devices can roam properly, I will enable this setting so that it can automatically adjust the AP power. However, when it does that, it will also lower the potential throughput for optimal speed. Is your customer really going to see the difference? Not so much. Not unless they do like a speed test, but speed tests are not reliable. They can vary from site to site and from, one scan from another. So that I only use them as a general rule of thumb to see what is being passed. However, just take note that that will be affecting the potential speed throughput, because when you lower power, you're going to lower that throughput. Next is going to be the radar avoidance pre-scanning. And here, we're just going to keep this defaulted and we're not going to change any settings. Next, we're going to do background scanning. With background scanning, you want to leave it as the default of 60, 60, and 20 seconds. However, if you're in rural areas, you can increase this number. Now, in more rural areas, you can adjust these. You can set it to 300 or so. What that's going to do is it's going to reduce how often it's scanning the background. We did this in order to reduce how much the APs are being utilized. However, if you don't have a lot of traffic or a lot of devices, the APs won't really be as affected as they were in the past, since they have better hardware now. So in this case, we can just leave it back to 60 and move on. Next, we're going to go back to the settings here and go to IP settings under the network settings section. Here we can see that we can have the AP be on DHCP or manual. In this case, I'm going to keep it DHCP because we don't really need to static the main AP. However, if you would like to, you can. You just set it to manual, set the IP address that you want, and you'll be good to go. We are not going to be setting a DHCP server. It is not recommended. You always want to use the router for your DHCP. So in this case, we're just going to set the AP to DHCP so it can grab the automatic address. Now the management interface is different. We're going to want to enable the management interface and we want to set a static IP. This is going to be the IP address that we want to set so that we can visit this address over and over again and not have to worry about what IP address the APs are using. In this case, I can set it to 80. I can then set it to 255.255.255.0, which is my /24, and I can hit apply. For our test, I won't hit apply, but this means that if I were to ever go to this address, I will always go into the web UI and not have to worry about finding the IP address of the master AP. Next, we're going to go to the Wi-Fi section now. So the Wi-Fi section you're going to see has both the AP list, the AP group, and the SSIDs that we're going to be listing. And you'll notice this new setting here, Sonos, and we'll get to that. First, we're going to start with the AP list. This is going to show us all the APs that we have connected. Right now, we just have the one outdoor AP. It's going to give us the information about it, the model, the IP address, and the power that it's using. Now here you're going to see AFC status pass. That was because we put in all that information earlier about the location, the longitude and latitude. If this has failed, you are not going to be broadcasting at full power and it will actually reduce the power that it's going to be broadcasting on. So you want to make sure that this shows passed, and you're going to be doing that by setting that latitude and longitude. And up here you're going to notice that here's the AP group list. This is where we're going to change the settings for all the APs. Now there are two ways to edit this. You can either select it and press edit, or you can select the system default and then you can hit configure here at the top. Either way, it'll take you to the same menu. Now, this is where you're going to assign all the SSIDs that we've created. In this case, we created test. So if you were to create additional SSIDs, they will automatically be applied since this is the default AP group. However, if you created a separate one, they will show as available WLANs that you can select for that new AP group that you've created. For the radio 2.4 gigahertz, we want to make sure that these channels are not selected. We only want 1, 6, and 11 because they don't overlap. And we're going to make sure that we're not going to hit apply just yet because that will take us back to the main menu for the AP group list. Now we're going to switch over to radio 5 gigahertz and we're going to just make sure that everything is set to auto. That is fine. Same thing with the 6 gigahertz. Everything is set to auto. You can see how many channels they have now, which is going to be great. But what you're going to see here is enable indoor AFC. We want to make sure that that is enabled. And again, that's going to be for the standard that we want to apply to make sure it's broadcasting at the power level that we can provide. Next, we'll go to model specified control. Now here we're going to see that we really don't need to do much. These are just the default settings. As far as the PoE operation mode, it's going to be set to auto, but if you ever need to change that, you can make those changes here to set it to PoE plus or PoE plus plus. However, just keeping it at auto should be fine even with a PoE injector. We want to hit apply to finish what we've done, and that'll apply all our settings to all the APs in our default group. Next, we're going to want to look at the Wi-Fi settings that we set for our SSID, so that we're going to go under Wi-Fi network list. And here we can see test. Again, we can either select this button and we can edit it, or we can disable it or even delete the SSID if we need to. However, with no SSIDs, that would be bad, so we don't want to do that. In this case, instead of edit, I'm just going to select test. And here we can see some information about what's going on. We're using 2.4 or 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz, and it's going to give us some information on what's going on with the SSID. And since we don't have anything connected, it's not going to display anything just yet. However, for the configuration, we want to look at the settings that we need to apply. So here we want to edit the settings, and encryption is going to be important in this case. With 6 gigahertz, WPA3 is required by standards for Wi-Fi that they set. However, when you have a WPA2, WPA3 mix, there's going to be a problem. When you're using Wi-Fi calling, if it switches between WPA3 and WPA2, it's going to consider that a new connection because it has to re-authenticate with this new encryption type. So the call is most likely going to drop, or you're going to have very bad audio traffic. So in this case, we do not want to use WPA2, WPA3 when you're setting up for your main SSID that you're going to have your streaming devices, but especially your phones. So in this case, I suggest creating one that's WPA3 only. Now, there's going to be a lot of devices that are still not compatible with WPA3. Some of them can be like IoT devices, thermostats, sprinklers, maybe some printers. And so it won't be able to connect to this encryption type, and you're going to have issues. So the solution for that will be to create a second SSID. So for this setup, we're going to use WPA3. We already have our password, and then we're going to go to our advanced options here. For the advanced options, if you need to change the VLAN that the SSID is on, this is where you're going to do it. So if your interface on your switch is tagged for VLAN 5, you would select 5. However, we're going to just leave this for 1 since we're not using VLANs. Now for access control, you're going to notice that it's pretty much the same settings. They just have a little bit more here associated with it. However, Wi-Fi calling is the one that we want. So we're going to make sure that we enable this, and then we're going to hit edit. And this will provide all our profiles that we want to switch over. So we'll select the top one, and then we'll hold shift and select the bottom one. This will highlight all of them, and then we can just move them over. Now that they're there, you can press OK, and and now the profiles are selected for Wi-Fi calling. Everything else you can leave as default. You don't need to do anything else. For this section, radio control. Radio control is going to be where you want to designate your SSID for certain settings. So in this case, we want to make sure that 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz is selected. We're not going to use 2.4 since we're going to apply settings that are not going to be good for IoT devices. Everything else can pretty much be standard. However, for the background scanning, that's going to be fine. 802.11. This roaming protocol, we technically do not enable this right offhand. In the past, there's been issues with Apple and this protocol. However, that's usually been resolved with the newer firmware. You can enable this if you're having issues with roaming, but we usually control that through the BSS min rate. So down here, we want to make sure that OFDM only is selected. And this is going to basically force newer connections and not allow the older style connections, which again is why we don't select that for IoT devices. Now, the BSS min rate, we're going to always set to 12 as our default. However, if let's say there's a little bit too much overlap with your access points, then you're going to want to switch that to 24 megabits per second, but we'll stick with the 12 for now. Next, we'll go to others. Now, as far as these settings, in the past, the directed MCBC needed to be disabled for Sonos, and that is still true. However, there is a new setting for Sonos that is available now, and we'll go over that setting in a minute. However, we still want to set the DTIM interval to 3, and that's going to be the changes that we're going to make for this SSID. Make sure you hit apply, Now all those settings have taken effect. So next, we're going to want to create our next SSID, and this is going to be, let's say, IoT. And so with IoT, again, we want to use the standard setup. We want to make sure that the authentication is open. We're going to set the standard to WPA2, and we're going to set a password. In this case, we're just going to use password 1 exclamation with a capital P, and that's just for my test. And then we're going to hit next. We're not going to need to do anything with this WLAN priority either. We're going to go to access control, nothing here, and radio control. A radio control is where we're going to make our changes. So in this case, this is just going to be for IoT. So we're turning off 5 gigahertz, 6 gigahertz. We're enabling 2.4. Everything else is pretty much going to stay standard. And we just want to set the BSS min rate to 12. That's the only change that we're going to make here. And then we're going to go to others. For others, we're just going to change the DTIM interval to 3 and hit add. Now we're going to have their QR code if you ever wanted to use that to connect to the Wi-Fi. However, we're not going to do that right now. All right, next, the Sonos. So Ruckus created a Sonos compatibility setting, and that's going to be enabled by default. However, this can be turned off or on. In this case, it doesn't matter if this is on or off for like other devices. It's not going to really do anything as far as harming the network. So you can just leave this as on and then move on to the next thing that you need to do. Next, we're going to create the guest SSID. So in this case, we're going to just name it guest. And we're going to use our guest access here. It's going to change some of our options. Now, authentication method, we're going to leave open. The encryption method, however, depending on if we want them to use 5 or 6 gigahertz. If you want them to use 6 gigahertz, it's going to have to be the WPA3. Now, in this case, we can use the WPA2, WPA3. However, again, if you want to use Wi-Fi calling, that's not going to be an option. So in this case, we're just going to create it with WPA3. We're going to set the password 1 exclamation, just like how we had the other one, and we're going to hit next. Now, scrolling up, we're going to see that there are some more settings here. In this case, there's like an onboarding portal. However, we're not going to be applying that. There's a guest authentication and social login. We're not going to be applying that because we're just using the password. The grace period, this is how many minutes that they can basically reconnect to the network without having to re-authenticate. So you can either disable or enable that. In this case, we can just leave it as enabled. Next is we can redirect them to the website that they're intending to go to, or you can redirect them to a specific website. In this case, we're just going to let them go to the website that they wanted to in the beginning. We do not have to turn on terms and conditions. That's going to be more for like a public setting. So as far as the captive portal, again, this is for more of a public setting. So we can just turn this off and we can just hit next. And now the restricted subnets here, they're under the advanced options. This we can leave as default. It just means that when we do client isolation, it's not going to be searching all these other subnets for other devices that those guest devices can connect to. VLAN priority, again, access VLAN, you can change that if you're going to change the VLAN. Otherwise, you can leave it as 1. Access control, same thing. Everything is going to say default. However, if you want to do Wi-Fi calling, we're going to enable that. We're going to hit edit. We're going to select the SSID, or sorry, not the SSIDs, but the profiles for Wi-Fi calling. And then we're going to scroll back up, go to radio control. And with radio control, we're going to remove the 2.4 gigahertz. 5 and 6 are going to stay there. OFDM only we are not going to enable, or we can enable it depending, again, if you're going to use Wi-Fi calling or not, if you're going to use anything else for the SSID. In this case, since we're going to use Wi-Fi calling, we're going to enable this. BSS min rate, we'll set to 12. Everything else should still stay the same. We're going to go to the next section, which is, we're going to skip wall garden. Basically, it's like a holding area before you actually get connected to the Wi-Fi. However, we do not need to set that. We'll go to others. Again, here, nothing we're really changing other than the DTI interval to set to 3. We're going to hit add. And now we've created our guest SSID. Now that we have the 3, we can now move on to seeing like, oh, I want a specific SSID for something else. Now we have our SSIDs created. Normally we can go into our client list and see what clients there are available with information. However, since we're doing a test, we don't have that information. Now, let's say you want to add another AP. So with another access point, you should be able to just plug it in and it will join the network, update if it needs to, if it's close enough firmware. But if you run into a situation where the AP is not joining because there's a firmware mismatch, either that's too old or it's on a different firmware version, then we're going to need to correct that. So as an example here, we have an access point. I found the IP address. I want to make sure that https:// is there. I'm going to press enter, and then it's going to give me this connection isn't private. That's fine. Go to advanced, continue on, and we're going to get this page. Now, the default login is going to be super sp-admin, and so you can see that here, sp-admin, and we're going to log in. In this case, I had already set a password, so I'm going to it's going to ask you for a password. In this case, super and password. And we're going to log in. And we can see here that it looks very different. But what we want to do in this case is just go to under maintenance, we want to go to upgrade. We're going to go to local, choose a file. And in this case, I already have the firmware. We're going to hit open and we're going to perform the upgrade. At this point, it will start updating the AP, and once it updates the AP, it's going to start joining the Unleashed network, and when it joins the network, it'll grab the configuration. You'll see the AP kind of reboot a couple of times. The thing to note is sometimes this does not go through, and that's usually a browser issue. So I would suggest using like Chrome's Incognito or even Firefox, and that should allow for the update to occur if it doesn't on just the default Google window or browser, I'm sorry. So we'll go back to the APs here. Now, in the past, we used to have to go to services for certain settings. However, in this case, there's not any that we're going to be interacting with in what we're programming. The only thing is you can go to Wi-Fi calling here and kind of see if Wi-Fi calling is working. If you see the active calls go through, it may take a few minutes for the call to actually be registered here, but this is where you'll see that information. The profiles are pre-built in, so you don't have to do anything for that. Going back to the Ruckus AP list, we're going to wait for the second AP to show up. Here you're going to see that the update is happening. So it's going to load this bar and afterwards it's going to reboot. So once you see this window, you know that the update is happening. We'll just wait for this to finish and it'll join the rest of the Unleashed network. So hitting refresh allowed us to see that the AP is showing as disconnected. That's good because that means that it's being registered, it's being updated, and pretty soon it will join the rest of the network. So you can periodically just wait for this, or you can just hit the refresh button a couple of times, but give it a few minutes to actually get the configuration. Now that we have the two APs here, we can select our first one here and we can hit configure. And with this, we want to make sure we change the name. So we're going to name this, let's say AP1 for this example. And you notice that here that the latitude and longitude is automatically set from the settings that we did earlier. We're going to hit apply. And we're going to go to the next AP and do the same thing. We're going to go to configure. And we're going to change the name to AP2. So now that it's set to AP2, we want to hit apply. Now, if you ever need to create an SSID just for a particular access point, for instance, you have an outdoor AP and you want an SSID just for the outside, or if you have an SSID for a specific device in the property where you don't want to broadcast everywhere else, then what we're going to do is we're going to set up an AP group to handle that. Creating this AP group is not going to be part of the standard configuration, but I thought I would show you how to do it since it usually comes up a lot. Next, we're going to want to create an AP group. So in this case, we're going to create a name. We'll just say test AP group. There we go. And we're going to select the second AP that we just created, and we want to move that over. Now that we've done that, we'll hit next, and we want to select the test 2. However, if we just select the test 2, that is the only SSID that we'll be broadcasting. Let's say we want the rest of them to be broadcasting as well. So again, you can select the top one, select the bottom one by holding shift and click, and that'll select all 3 of them. Then you can move them over. That way, it's going to be broadcasting all our normal SSIDs, including our new one that we want only broadcasting on this specific access point. We'll hit next. Everything else is going to be pretty much the same configuration that you already had set up with your default AP group. So all you need to do is hit add. And so now under this new AP group, the second AP here, AP2, will now be broadcasting the 4th SSID, but our AP1 would only be broadcasting only the 3 SSIDs. Now, you will notice something. When we scroll over to the right, we're going to see the information about the AFC status. One has passed and one is waiting for a response. The reason why is because it takes time for this to apply. So it can take anywhere from 15 minutes to 1 hour. What's happening is that it's sending the information over to the server and stating which SSID it needs to be on. You'll notice the AFC status. One has passed and one is waiting for a response. What's happening is, since we just added this AP, it's waiting for a response from the server. It's sending the request saying like, hey, I'm at this location, I have these channels, and so it's waiting for the server to respond saying that it has fulfilled its requirements, and it will show pass and start broadcasting at the 6 gigahertz radio with standard power. Right now, it's showing 6 gigahertz radio is off. This time frame can take 15 minutes to perhaps even an hour. So you want to give this time to be able to do that. So I would suggest continuing on doing what you need to do and then coming back to check to see if the AFC status has passed. Now, if you need to create a backup, what you want to do is go to Administration and go to Backup and Restore. Here we want to create the backup. You're just going to click this button and it will download the file onto your computer. You'll see it here. This is going to be great in case you're going to make any changes or if you want to have one just in case something goes horribly wrong. It shouldn't, since the APs are all working off of each other, so if one AP goes down, another one will just take its place, but it's always good to have that backup. If you want to restore that, then you're just simply going to go to System Restore, browse for the file, and then you'll be able to restore the configuration on another access point. For factory default, we're just going to hit the Restore to Factory Settings button. And again, this will delete all the configuration that we have done today. And anything that's connected to the Unleashed system will be defaulted. However, if you have a separate AP that is not connected and you still need to default it, then you'll need to make sure that the AP is on. Hold that reset button for 8 seconds and then release. That'll allow the AP to default on its own. But again, if you have any APs configured on the system and the AP is defaulted, it will grab the configuration of anything that's still connected. So just keep those tips in mind when trying to do a factory default to either the whole group or individual APs. Next, we want to go to Administration and Upgrade. This is where you're going to upgrade your access points. In this case, we can see what supported AP models are listed under the current firmware version. This is super useful, and take note that it does not include any of the APs that were of the previous generation. So any of the R510s, R610s, the R320s, they will not be compatible with this current firmware. As of right now, we're on the updated firmware, so there's nothing to select here. However, you can always do check for updates to see if anything new has come in. Typically, we try to test the firmware before actually recommending it. So in this case, this will be the current recommended firmware version. And if you need to do a local upgrade, you'll select the local upgrade. However, when you do the upgrade option, it's going to show all the APs. You want to make sure that they're in there. Otherwise, you're going to have to update the other APs individually, potentially. For the local upgrade, same thing. You can select an image file just by selecting it here, or you can preload an image. But in this case, you would just do browse, select the firmware update, and then you would hit the update button. But in this case, since we don't need to select anything, the option is not showing up. Finally, you'll see that there is a switch here that's disconnected. Now, we have this switch here in our testing bench. However, we will not be joining it to our Unleashed network. But essentially, you should be able to add the switch. It's going to tell you what model it is, what the MAC address, the IP address is, and you can enter that IP address here, and that will allow it to join up. It's going to ask you for the credentials, and you will enter that, and allowing the switch to come online, giving you some options available to see the interfaces as it was before. But in this case, we are not adding this switch, but that would be the process. And that'll complete our setup. Hopefully this guide was super useful to you guys. And if you have any questions, again, please feel free to call us. We'll be happy to answer all your questions. And if you notice anything else that you would like to be added to this video, please let us know and we'll be happy to include them as well. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.